She sold her wedding dress to save her son. She never imagined the man who bought it once broke her heart. Emma Rivers stood alone in the quiet living room, the late afternoon light spilling softly through the thin curtains and settling on the wooden floor. In her hands, she held her wedding dress. It was carefully folded, the fabric still smooth and white, though time had dulled its shine. Once, it had felt impossibly light, as if it carried all her hopes with it. Now it felt heavy, as though every memory stitched into its seams pressed against her chest. She remembered the day she wore it, the laughter, the certainty, the belief that love was enough to protect them from everything. Back then, the future had seemed simple and kind. She had believed in promises without conditions, in a life that would unfold exactly as planned. That version of herself felt like a stranger now. Emma lowered herself onto the edge of the couch and traced her fingers along the lace. For a moment, she allowed herself to hesitate. Selling the dress felt like crossing a line, like admitting that some things could never be recovered. But hesitation was a luxury she no longer had. From the next room came the faint, uneven sound of breathing. Her heart tightened instantly. She rose and walked to the doorway, watching her son sleep. Leo lay curled beneath a small blue blanket, one hand clenched around a worn toy car. His dark hair fell into his forehead, and his eyelashes rested against pale cheeks that had grown thinner in recent weeks. Even in sleep, there was a seriousness about him that did not belong to a 4-year-old. The doctor's words echoed in her mind with merciless clarity. Cancer. Early stage. Treatable. Each word had sounded almost merciful on its own, yet together they formed a sentence that had changed everything. There was hope, they had said. But hope had a price, and it was far beyond what Emma could afford. She pressed her palm lightly against the doorframe, steadying herself. Leo's eyes were her favorite thing in the world, bright blue, startlingly vivid, the kind that seemed to hold too much light for such a small body. People often commented on them, asking where he had gotten such eyes. Emma never answered. Some truths were too complicated to explain, and others were too painful to speak aloud. Back in the living room, she opened the box and placed the dress inside. The lid hovered in her hands as her throat tightened. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely more than breath. She wasn't sure whether she was apologizing to the past, to herself, or to the woman she had once been. That evening, she sat at her laptop long after the sun had set, the room lit only by the glow of the screen. Her fingers trembled slightly as she typed the description. No story, no names, just the dress, its size, its condition, and a price that reflected desperation rather than value. She listed it anonymously, reducing her identity to 2 simple initials. When she finally clicked submit, a strange calm settled over her. The decision was made. The dress was no longer a symbol of what she had lost, but a chance, fragile and uncertain, yet real, to save the one person who mattered more than anything else. Emma closed the laptop and leaned back, staring into the darkness. Tomorrow, everything would be the same, and yet nothing would ever be the same again. Daniel Hayes was not a man who browsed auctions in his spare time. His days were measured in meetings, numbers, and decisions that moved millions with a single signature. Time, to him, was a resource more valuable than money, and he guarded it carefully. That evening was no different. He sat in the back seat of his car, phone pressed to his ear, listening to his assistant list the final details of a merger that would dominate the financial news by morning. When the call ended, Daniel exhaled slowly and loosened his tie. The city lights slid past the window in long, blurred lines. Out of habit rather than interest, he opened his tablet and tapped through unread notifications, dismissing most of them without thought. One unfamiliar email remained, marked as a charity auction invitation, forwarded by someone from his foundation. He almost deleted it, almost. The page loaded slowly, revealing a clean, minimal layout filled with photographs of donated items. Art, jewelry, vintage watches, things he could afford without noticing the expense. His attention drifted, unfocused, until his eyes stopped on a simple image. A white wedding dress laid out against a neutral background. There was nothing extravagant about it. No dramatic pose, no elaborate setting. Just fabric, lace, and silence. And yet something in his chest shifted, subtle but undeniable. Daniel frowned, irritated by the sensation. He enlarged the image, studying it with a critical eye, as if it were an investment proposal rather than a dress. The lace along the sleeves was familiar. The cut of the bodice stirred a memory he had not touched in years. He told himself it was coincidence that countless dresses looked the same. Still, he kept staring. The description was brief, almost clinical. Size, condition, no history, no explanation. The seller's name was reduced to 2 initials. ER for reasons he could not articulate. The anonymity unsettled him more than any dramatic backstory might have. It felt deliberate, as if someone had carefully removed themselves from the object they were giving away. Daniel checked the price and raised his eyebrows. It was high, but not unreasonable. Not for a wedding dress in good condition. Yet something about it felt wrong, not overpriced, but underexplained. As if the number meant something beyond money. He glanced at the clock. He should have closed the page. He had a dinner reservation, a schedule to maintain, a life built on precision and control. Instead, he found himself scrolling back to the image, his mind drifting to places he usually kept locked. Years ago, he had believed in permanence. In love that did not require negotiation. In a future shaped by certainty rather than compromise. That belief had cost him more than he liked to admit, and he had learned from it. Or so he thought. Without fully deciding to do so, Daniel clicked the bid button. The interface asked for confirmation. He hesitated, his finger hovering over the screen. The logical part of his mind listed reasons to stop. This was unnecessary, impulsive, meaningless. But another part, quieter and older, urged him forward. He entered an amount twice as high as the starting price and confirmed the payment. The notification appeared instantly, payment successful. Daniel stared at the screen, a strange tightness settling in his chest. He felt no thrill, no satisfaction. Instead, there was a faint, persistent unease, as though he had just agreed to something far more significant than a purchase. As the car slowed in front of his building, another message appeared. Order confirmed. Seller. ER. The initials lingered in his thoughts long after he stepped into the quiet of his penthouse. He poured himself a drink he barely tasted and stood by the window, looking out at the city below. He told himself it was nothing. A charitable expense. A forgotten transaction. Yet, for the first time in years, Daniel had the unsettling feeling that a door he thought was firmly closed had quietly begun to open. Emma arrived at the foundation building earlier than she needed to. The morning air was cool, carrying the faint smell of rain and concrete, and she stood outside for several minutes before going in, her hands clasped tightly around the strap of her worn leather bag. She told herself she was early because she didn't want to rush, because she needed time to gather her thoughts. In truth, she was afraid of being late, afraid of missing something that might somehow matter more than she understood yet. Inside, the building was quiet and softly lit, its white walls decorated with abstract paintings donated by artists whose names Emma did not recognize. A receptionist greeted her politely and asked her to take a seat. Emma nodded and sat down, smoothing her skirt with nervous fingers. Her heart beat faster than it should have for such a simple appointment. This was only paperwork, she reminded herself. A formality. The dress was already sold. The money was already transferred. This meeting was nothing more than a final step. She tried to focus on the brochure on the table in front of her, but the words blurred together. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Leo, to the way he had smiled that morning despite the nausea that had followed his medication. He had waved from the bed when she left, his small hand raised with more strength than she felt inside herself. That image stayed with her, anchoring her to the reason she was here. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. Emma looked up without thinking, and the world seemed to tilt. The man walking toward the reception desk was tall, dressed in a dark coat that fit him perfectly, his posture confident and unmistakably familiar. His dark hair was neatly styled, just as it had always been, and when he turned his head slightly, the light caught his eyes, blue. For a brief, dizzy moment, Emma wondered if her mind was betraying her. Grief and exhaustion could do strange things. She blinked, once, then again. He was still there. Her breath caught in her throat. Daniel? The name slipped out before she could stop it, barely louder than a whisper. He turned. The expression on his face shifted slowly, moving from polite indifference to confusion, then to something far more vulnerable. His gaze locked onto hers, and she saw recognition hit him like a physical force. Emma. His voice was quiet, almost uncertain, as if saying her name required effort. Time seemed to collapse in on itself. Years of silence, arguments left unfinished, words never spoken, all of it pressed into the space between them. Emma stood up on unsteady legs, suddenly aware of how thin she felt, how exposed. She had not prepared for this. She had not imagined a face for the buyer, let alone this one. "I didn't know it was you," she said quickly, the words tumbling over one another. "I swear, I had no idea." Daniel took a step closer, then stopped, as if unsure whether he was allowed to cross that distance. He looked at her carefully, as though trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the one he remembered. She looked older, he realized. Not in years but in weight, an invisible heaviness carried in her eyes, in the way her shoulders curved inward. "I didn't know either," he replied. The seller was anonymous. They stood there, surrounded by quiet and strangers, feeling painfully out of place. The receptionist cleared her throat gently and gestured toward a small conference room. "You can complete the transfer documents inside." Emma nodded, grateful for the interruption. She walked ahead, aware of Daniel following her, the sound of his footsteps stirring memories she had spent years trying to bury. The room was small and private, with a round table and 2 chairs. A box sat in the center, unmistakable even without opening it. The dress. Emma's gaze dropped to it, and her chest tightened. She took her seat and folded her hands together, staring at her fingers as if they might tell her what to say next. Daniel sat across from her. Up close, she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the signs of a life lived fast and hard. He studied her in return, his expression guarded but intense. "I never thought I'd see you again," he said quietly. "I didn't think I would either," Emma replied. "Not like this." Silence settled between them, heavy but not hostile. It was filled with everything they had once been and everything they had lost. Emma could feel her heart pounding, each beat a reminder that this moment was real, unavoidable. She lifted her eyes to meet his. For the first time since he had walked in, she did not look away. "Thank you," she said. "For buying the dress. You didn't have to." Daniel frowned slightly. "I felt like I did." The honesty in his voice unsettled her. She swallowed, unsure how much to say, how much of herself she could reveal in this fragile space. Outside the room, the world continued as usual. Inside, 2 people who had once loved each other sat across from a past neither of them had expected to face again. And though neither of them knew it yet, this meeting was not an ending. It was the beginning of something far more complicated and far more profound than either was prepared for. They remained in the small conference room long after the paperwork was finished. The foundation employee had collected the signed documents, thanked them politely, and left them alone with the box on the table and a silence that felt heavier with every passing second. Emma could hear the faint hum of the building, the distant sounds of voices in the hallway, yet inside the room everything felt suspended, as if the world outside had been muted. Daniel was the first to speak. "Why?" he asked quietly. Emma knew immediately what he meant. It wasn't about the dress itself, not really. He was looking at her with a seriousness she remembered well, the kind that appeared when he needed the truth, not a version softened for comfort. She lowered her gaze, gathering strength. Her hands trembled slightly as she laced her fingers together. "I didn't sell it because I wanted to," she said. "I sold it because I had no other choice." Daniel leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "You could have asked me." The words landed harder than he intended. Emma flinched, then shook her head slowly. "No. I couldn't. Not after everything." For a moment, he said nothing. Then, more carefully, "Everything doesn't erase the fact that I would have helped you." Emma let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "That's easy to say now." She stood up and walked toward the window, needing distance to breathe. Outside, the sky was overcast, heavy with low gray clouds. She rested her forehead lightly against the glass, then turned back to face him. Her eyes were bright, but steady. "I have a son," she said. Daniel straightened instantly. "A son?" "Yes." Her voice was calm, almost too calm, as if she were speaking about someone else's life. "He's 4 years old. His name is Leo." Daniel stared at her, trying to process the words. "Why didn't you tell me?" Emma took a slow breath. "Because when I found out I was pregnant, you were already gone. Not physically, you were still there, but your mind was somewhere else. Your company, your ambitions, the future you wanted. I didn't want to be another obstacle." "That wasn't your decision to make," he said, his voice rising despite himself. "I know," she replied softly. "But it was the only one I thought I had." Silence stretched between them again, thicker now, filled with something sharp and aching. Daniel rubbed a hand over his face, as if trying to wake from a dream he didn't understand. "And the dress?" he asked at last. Emma swallowed. "Leo is sick." The word seemed to drain the color from the room. "Sick how?" Daniel asked, though something in his expression suggested he already feared the answer. "He has cancer," she said. "Early stage. The doctors say the prognosis is good, if we treat it aggressively." "But the treatment?" Her voice faltered for the first time. "The treatment is expensive." Daniel's chest tightened painfully. He stood up slowly, as though his body needed time to adjust to the weight of what he was hearing. "Cancer," he repeated, barely above a whisper. Emma nodded. "That's why I sold the dress." Daniel turned away, pacing the small room. His thoughts raced, colliding with memories and questions he had never imagined he would ask. A child, her child, their child. He stopped suddenly and looked at her again, his eyes searching her face with a new intensity. "What does he look like?" he asked. Emma hesitated, then answered honestly. "He has dark hair." Daniel's breath caught. "And his eyes?" His voice was strained now. "Blue." The room went utterly still. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment, and when he opened them again, they were filled with shock and something deeper, something raw. He took a step toward her, then another, stopping just short of reaching for her. "He's mine," he said, not as a question, but as a realization. "Yes," Emma replied. "He is." The truth hung between them, undeniable and irreversible. Daniel felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted, his carefully constructed world cracking open to reveal something both terrifying and profoundly important. A son he had never known. A life that had existed without him. "You should have told me," he said, his voice breaking despite his effort to remain composed. Emma met his gaze without flinching. "I was afraid. Afraid you would see him as a responsibility instead of a person. Afraid you would resent us both." Daniel shook his head slowly. "I would never resent my child." Tears welled in Emma's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "I didn't know that then." They stood facing each other, separated by years of silence and one devastating truth. The dress in the box was forgotten now, insignificant compared to what had been revealed. Neither of them knew what would come next, only that there was no turning back. The past had finally caught up with them, and it demanded to be faced. Daniel moved with a kind of urgency Emma had never seen in him before. The moment the truth settled between them, he shifted from shock to action, as if motion were the only way to keep himself from breaking apart. He asked questions, precise, focused ones, about doctors, diagnoses, treatment plans. Emma answered as best she could, still struggling to adjust to the fact that she was no longer carrying this burden alone. Within hours, things began to change. The next morning, Daniel met them at the hospital. Emma noticed how out of place he looked at first, standing in the pediatric oncology wing in an immaculate suit, surrounded by pale walls and small chairs meant for anxious parents. Yet he adapted quickly. He rolled up his sleeves, spoke softly to nurses, listened carefully to every explanation. Money, which had always been his greatest strength, became a tool rather than a shield. He arranged consultations with specialists she had only read about online. New scans were scheduled. Second and third opinions were requested without hesitation. When Emma protested, overwhelmed by the speed of it all, Daniel looked at her steadily and said, "There's no such thing as too much caution when it comes to him." Leo met his father 2 days later. Emma watched from the doorway as Daniel knelt in front of her son, bringing himself down to Leo's level. For the first time since she had known him, Daniel looked uncertain. "Hi," he said gently. "I'm Daniel." Leo studied him with open curiosity, his bright blue eyes taking everything in. "You're tall," he observed. Daniel smiled, a real smile, unguarded and warm. "That's true." There was no dramatic moment, no instant recognition. Just a quiet connection forming, fragile and honest. When Leo reached out and tugged lightly at Daniel's sleeve, something inside Daniel shifted forever. From that day on, he was there. Every morning, every evening, whenever his schedule allowed, and he rearranged his schedule more than Emma thought possible. He learned the routines of the hospital, the rhythms of treatment days and rest days. He learned which cartoons Leo liked, which foods he could stomach after medication, how to distract him during blood tests with stories and silly voices. The nights were the hardest. Emma often sat awake beside Leo's bed, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, her fear pressing in on her from all sides. Sometimes Daniel sat with her in silence, their shoulders nearly touching, sharing the same exhaustion. Other times, he paced the hallway, making quiet phone calls, his voice low and controlled as he fought battles she never saw. There were moments when the weight of everything became too much. One evening, after a particularly difficult day of tests, Emma broke down in the hospital corridor, covering her face with her hands. Daniel didn't speak. He simply pulled her into a careful embrace, holding her as if she might shatter. "I should have been here sooner," he murmured. Emma shook her head against his chest. "We're here now. That's what matters." Gradually, small victories appeared. A scan came back slightly better than expected. A treatment was tolerated better than the last. The doctors spoke cautiously, but with growing optimism. Emma clung to those moments, learning to measure hope in inches rather than miles. One afternoon, Leo sat on the bed, swinging his legs and studying Daniel with serious concentration. "You look like me," he said suddenly. Daniel froze. Emma held her breath. Daniel glanced at her, then back at Leo. His throat tightened, and he turned away, pretending to examine something on the windowsill so his son wouldn't see his eyes fill with tears. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think we do." For the first time since the diagnosis, Emma allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't end in fear. It was still uncertain, still fragile, but now it included something she had never dared to hope for before: a family fighting together instead of apart. The hospital became a strange kind of second home. Days blurred together, marked not by dates but by test results, medication schedules, and the quiet rituals Emma and Daniel developed without ever discussing them. There were long hours of waiting, interrupted by brief moments of relief or fear, and in those hours, conversation became inevitable. Most of it happened at night. When Leo finally fell asleep, exhausted from treatment, Emma and Daniel would sit in the small family lounge down the hall. The lights were dim, the air heavy with the unspoken worries of other parents who passed through quietly. Sometimes they spoke in low voices. Other times they simply sat, listening to the hum of the vending machines and the distant beeping of monitors. One night, Daniel broke the silence first. "I used to think I knew exactly what I wanted," he said, staring at his hands. "Success, control, stability. I built my life around those things." Emma leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed loosely. And now I realize how small that world was." He looked up at her. "I missed so much. Not just Leo. You." The honesty in his voice unsettled her. She had spent years protecting herself from these conversations, from the possibility that revisiting the past might reopen wounds she had barely survived. Yet here they were, unable to avoid it any longer. "I didn't leave because I stopped loving you," she said quietly. "I left because I felt invisible. Like there was no space for me in your future." Daniel nodded slowly. "I know. I see it now. Back then, I thought providing was enough. I didn't understand that being present mattered more." Emma studied his face, searching for the arrogance she once resented. It wasn't there. In its place was regret, raw and unguarded. "I was scared," she admitted. "When I found out I was pregnant, I convinced myself I was doing the right thing by staying silent. I told myself you were better off without the complication." Daniel exhaled sharply. "You took my choice away." "Yes," she said. "And I've lived with that every day." The words hung between them, heavy but necessary. There was no accusation left in her tone, only truth. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of it. "I can't change what I did," she continued. "And I can't undo the years you missed. But I won't lie anymore. Not to you. Not to myself." Daniel looked at her then with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "I don't want to rewrite the past," he said. "I just want a chance to do better now." They spoke about smaller things too, about the years in between. Emma told him about the nights she worked double shifts, about the quiet apartment filled with toys and exhaustion. Daniel told her about the success that had come at a cost he had never fully acknowledged, about the loneliness that lingered even in rooms full of people. Slowly, something shifted. The anger that had once defined their memories softened into something more complex: grief for what they had lost, and cautious respect for what they had endured separately. There were moments when silence returned, but it no longer felt hostile. It felt reflective. One night, as they stood outside Leo's room watching him sleep, Emma spoke without turning to face Daniel. "I'm not asking you to fix everything." "I know," he replied. I'm not asking you to come back, she continued, her voice steady but fragile. I don't even know what that would mean anymore. Daniel stepped closer, careful not to cross a line she hadn't invited him to cross. I'm not asking you to forget, he said softly. I just want us to be honest. For Leo. For ourselves. Emma nodded slowly. Honesty felt terrifying, but also strangely freeing. For the first time in years, she wasn't carrying the weight of her past alone. Outside, the night stretched on, indifferent and quiet. Inside, two people who had once broken each other apart began, cautiously, to rebuild something new. Not from promises, but from truth. Recovery did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, in cautious words spoken by doctors who had learned never to promise too much. Emma learned to read their expressions, to notice the subtle changes in tone that signaled progress. A slightly longer pause before concern. A hint of relief behind professional restraint. She clung to those signs, even when fear still lurked in the quiet moments. The day the doctor finally said the word remission, Emma felt as if the air had been knocked out of her lungs. She sat frozen in the chair, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk, while the meaning slowly reached her. Leo was still playing on the floor with a plastic dinosaur, blissfully unaware that his life had just shifted onto a different path. Daniel was the first to react. He knelt beside Leo and pulled him into a careful embrace, his hand resting protectively on the back of the boy's head. Emma watched them, tears blurring her vision, as something she hadn't realized she was holding inside finally broke free. She cried silently at first, then openly, her shoulders shaking as months of fear poured out of her all at once. Life did not instantly return to normal. There were follow-up visits, medications, routines that still revolved around caution. But the constant tension that had once filled every breath began to loosen. Mornings felt lighter. Emma started sleeping through the night without waking in panic. Leo's laughter returned, louder and more frequent, filling spaces that had once been heavy with worry. Daniel became a constant presence. Not only at appointments, but in the quiet, ordinary moments Emma had learned to handle alone. He helped Leo build elaborate structures out of blocks, read bedtime stories with exaggerated voices, and learned how to cook the simple meals Leo loved. He made mistakes, sometimes trying too hard, sometimes stepping in where Emma hadn't asked him to. But when she spoke up, he listened. Truly listened. One afternoon, as they sat together in the small park near Emma's apartment, Leo ran ahead toward the swings, his energy almost overwhelming after months of restraint. Emma watched him carefully, still adjusting to the idea that she no longer had to fear every scraped knee or flushed cheek. He's stronger than I ever was at his age, Daniel said quietly, standing beside her. Emma nodded. He had to be. There was no bitterness in her tone. Just truth. Their relationship changed slowly, in ways that did not announce themselves. They shared dinners that turned into conversations stretching late into the evening. They began making decisions together, about Leo's school, about schedules, about holidays that no longer felt so distant or uncertain. They argued sometimes, old habits resurfacing, but the arguments no longer carried the threat of abandonment. They ended in compromise, in understanding. Trust returned carefully, like something fragile that needed protection. Months passed. The hospital visits grew less frequent. The fear, though never entirely gone, receded into the background. Emma found herself laughing more, thinking less about survival and more about living. One evening, as Leo slept peacefully in his bed, Daniel sat with Emma on the couch, the soft glow of a lamp casting long shadows across the room. He reached for her hand, hesitating just long enough for her to notice. I'm not asking for answers, he said. I just want you to know that I'm here. Not because I have to be. Because I want to be. Emma looked at their joined hands, then up at him. She didn't pull away. I'm still afraid, she admitted. Of hoping for too much. Daniel squeezed her hand gently. So am I. In the months that followed, hope stopped feeling dangerous. It became something quiet and steady, woven into daily life. And when Emma realized she was pregnant again, fear and joy collided in a way she had never experienced before. The night she told Daniel, his reaction was nothing like the one she had once imagined years ago. He sat in stunned silence, then let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. He pulled her into his arms, holding her with a care that spoke of everything they had survived. A year later, Emma held their daughter in her arms, marveling at how something so small could feel so overwhelming. They named her Lily. She slept peacefully against Emma's chest, unaware of the long road that had led to her existence. Leo stood beside them, proudly announcing to anyone who would listen that he was a big brother now. Emma looked at her family and felt something settle inside her, an unfamiliar sense of peace. Life was still unpredictable, pain was still possible, but joy, she realized, was possible too. The morning was calm in a way Emma had once believed no longer existed. Soft light filled the bedroom, moving slowly across the walls as if it had nowhere else to be. She stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the delicate fabric of her dress, and for a moment she simply watched her reflection breathe. The woman looking back at her felt familiar, yet changed, shaped by loss, fear, and a strength she had never known she possessed. This dress was different from the first. There was no weight of desperation tied to it, no memories of promises made too easily. She had chosen it carefully, not for how it looked in photographs, but for how it felt when she moved. Light, honest, real. It did not represent who she used to be, but who she had become. Behind her, the door opened quietly. Leo peeked inside first, his dark hair still slightly messy despite Emma's earlier attempts to tame it. He was dressed in a small suit that made him look older than his years, his blue eyes bright with excitement. "Mom," he whispered loudly, "Dad says we're almost ready." Emma smiled, kneeling to his level and smoothing his jacket. "Are you nervous?" He considered the question seriously. "A little, but in a good way." Daniel appeared in the doorway then, Lily cradled in his arms. The baby slept peacefully, unaware of the significance of the day, her tiny fingers curled against his chest. Watching him like this, steady, present, gentle, Emma felt a quiet ache in her heart, not of pain, but of gratitude. "You look beautiful," Daniel said softly. Emma met his gaze in the mirror. "So do you," she replied, and meant far more than the words suggested. The ceremony was small, held in a sunlit garden surrounded by a few close friends and family members who had walked alongside them through the hardest moments. There was no grandeur, no need to impress. Every person present knew what it had taken for them to stand there together. As Emma walked forward, she felt Leo's small hand slip into hers. Daniel watched them approach, emotion written openly on his face. When Emma reached him, he took her hand with a certainty that felt earned rather than assumed. They spoke their vows without rushing. There were no dramatic declarations, no promises of perfection. Instead, they spoke of choice, of listening, of staying when it was easier to leave, of building something not from illusion but from truth. When Daniel said, "Forever isn't a guarantee, it's a decision," Emma felt tears gather in her eyes. When she answered, "And I choose you," her voice did not waver. Afterward, the day unfolded gently. Leo ran through the garden with other children, laughter echoing between the trees. Lily slept in Emma's arms, her presence a quiet miracle. Conversations flowed easily, unburdened by the fear that had once dominated every interaction. As the sun began to set, Emma and Daniel stood together, watching their children. Emma leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. "There were so many moments I thought we wouldn't make it here," she said softly. Daniel kissed her hair. "So did I, but we did," she replied. Later that evening, after the guests had gone and the house had grown quiet, Emma stood once more in front of a mirror, this time in the soft glow of lamplight. The dress hung loosely now, no longer symbolic of hope or sacrifice, but of something deeper, resilience. Daniel came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. Their reflection showed two people who had learned, painfully and slowly, how to stand together again. "I don't promise a perfect life," he said quietly. "But I promise to show up. Every day." Emma placed her hands over his. "That's all I've ever wanted." In the next room, Leo's laughter drifted softly as he talked in his sleep, and Lily stirred, then settled again. Life moved forward, not without scars, not without uncertainty, but filled with purpose. For the first time in many years, Emma did not look toward the future with fear. She looked at it with trust, knowing that whatever came next, she would not face it alone. You don't always have to save love. Sometimes you have to save honesty. The past cannot be rewritten, but you can change who you become after it. And when life offers a second chance, it rarely comes beautifully wrapped. More often, it comes through pain, fear, and the need to be stronger than you ever thought possible. Could you forgive someone if you discovered they lost an entire life because they never knew the truth? This story is entirely fictional and created by the author of the channel. Any resemblance to real people is purely coincidental.